Ruth Calloway was 34 years old, and she had $11.60 to her name. That was all that was left after the bank took the farm, after the fever took her husband, after 2 dry summers took everything else. A dog who would not leave her side sat close beside that money. His name was Duke, a rangy shepherd mix with one ear that never stood upright, and he had slept across her feet every night since the funeral, like he feared she might disappear too, if he closed his eyes. In 3 days, Ruth planned to spend nearly every cent she had on a quarter section of land nobody else in Miller's Bend wanted, a stretch of cracked earth, with an old windmill standing dead center of it, silent for 50 years. The men at the feed store called it cursed. The women at church called it a shame, a young widow throwing her last dollars away on dust and rust. Ruth just called it hers, or she would, come Thursday. Duke sat beside her on the porch step that evening, ears turning toward the wind, and Ruth scratched behind the good one, and looked out at nothing in particular. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway and her faithful dog Duke. Before we go on, tell us in the comments if you have ever felt like the underdog, like everyone around you had already decided you'd lost. Or if you've ever found real value in something the world had written off. We read every one. Ruth had grown up on a farm 40 miles east of Miller's Bend, the only daughter of a man named Amos Whitfield, who could fix anything with wire and patience, and a little bit of stubbornness. Amos had a saying he repeated so often, that Ruth could hear it in his voice even now, years after his passing. Nothing is finished being useful, just because folks stopped looking at it. He said it about broken plows, about lame mules, about the creek bed that dried up every August and filled again every spring like clockwork, like it was only resting. He said it, once, about Ruth herself, the summer she broke her leg falling from the hayloft, and every neighbor woman clucked about how she'd never be much good on a farm now. Amos carried her out to the porch every morning for 2 months, so she could watch the work get done, and told her a body finds new ways to be useful, the same as anything else. Ruth carried that lesson the way other women carried scripture. Amos taught her other things too, practical things a farm girl needed to know. How to read the sky for weather, how to splint a broken fence post, how to listen for the particular groan a windmill makes right before its gears seize up, so you could grease them before real damage set in. He taught her that water was the one thing a person could never take for granted out on the plains, that a good well was worth more than gold, and that the men who controlled the water in a dry country held more power than any mayor or sheriff, whether folks realized it or not. Ruth used to think that was just an old farmer's worry, the kind of thing fathers said to keep their daughters cautious. She did not know yet how true it would turn out to be. She met Daniel Calloway at a harvest dance when she was 19, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who farmed wheat on 160 acres just south of Miller's Bend. He did not say much, but what he did say, he meant, and he had a way of listening to Ruth, like her words were the most important thing he'd heard all week. They married the following spring. For 12 years, they built something together. A house with a good stove, a barn that never leaked, 200 laying hens, and a small herd of cattle that grew a little each season. It was not wealth, it was enough, and enough had always felt like plenty to Ruth. Duke came to them in the 6th year of their marriage, a half-starved pup that showed up at the property line during a thunderstorm, and would not leave no matter how many times Daniel tried to shoo him back toward wherever he'd come from. Ruth fed him a bowl of milk and bread on the porch, and that was that. He grew into a rangy, watchful dog who slept in the barn, but spent his days at Ruth's heel, following her from the chicken coop to the garden to the washing line like she was the only fixed point in a world that otherwise wobbled. Daniel used to laugh, and say the dog loved her more than he did, though he never meant it unkindly. Ruth thought, privately, that it might even be true, and she loved Duke fiercely for it. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch steps, shelling peas or mending shirts, and Duke would rest his head heavy on her knee, sighing the way dogs do when the world feels settled and safe. He was not a clever dog in the way people sometimes meant that word, not one for tricks or fetching slippers, but he had a steadiness to him, an attentiveness, as if he were always quietly keeping watch over something precious that only he could see the shape of. Ruth had never met another animal quite like him, and she never would again. The trouble started slow, the way trouble on a farm usually does. 2 dry summers in a row cracked the wheat fields into something that looked more like a dry lakebed than a farm. The cattle thinned, the banknote that Daniel had taken out to buy a new plow, and a second well, came due at the worst possible time, and though Daniel worked from before sunup until after dark, trying to make up the difference, the numbers never quite closed. Neither of them could have known yet that the very ground beneath their feet held a secret that would one day undo everything the bank thought it had won. Then, in the coldest part of the following winter, Daniel came down with a fever that would not break. Ruth sat up with him for 11 nights, wringing cloths in cold water, praying in a way she had not prayed since she was a girl. Duke lay pressed against the sickbed the entire time, refusing food, refusing to be moved, as though his stillness alone might hold Daniel to the earth. It did not. Daniel died on the 12th morning, quietly, with Ruth's hand in his and Duke's head resting on his boot. Grief alone might have been bearable, in time. But grief came paired with ruin. Without Daniel's labor, without a second season to recover the losses, the farm could not carry its debt. The bank, run by a smooth, careful man named Silas Pruitt, foreclosed within 4 months of the funeral. Pruitt came to the house himself to deliver the news, hat in hand, voice soft with a sympathy that never quite reached his eyes. He told Ruth he was sorry for her troubles, that a note was a note no matter whose husband had died holding it, and offered her a fair price for what little equipment remained, a price she would later understand was not fair at all. Pruitt had a way of making his own convenience sound like inevitability, and Ruth was not the first widow in that county to learn it the hard way. Ruth was given 3 weeks to gather what she could carry, and vacate the only home she had built as a grown woman. She sold the furniture piece by piece to neighbors who could not quite meet her eyes while they haggled over prices. She sold the cattle for less than they were worth, to a buyer who knew she had no leverage left to negotiate with. By the time it was finished, Ruth had a wagon, a trunk of clothes, a dog, and $11.60, and nowhere in particular to be. She took a small room above the Mercantile in Miller's Bend, paid week to week, and tried to think of what came next. The town was not unkind to her, exactly, but it watched her the way small towns watch any woman alone, with a mixture of pity and quiet judgment, as though her misfortune might be catching. Women who had once invited her to quilting circles now offered sympathetic smiles and little else. Ruth understood it. She had done the same, once, to other unlucky families, without meaning any harm by it. Loss made people uncomfortable, and discomfort made people scarce. It was in that small room, 3 weeks into her new life, that Ruth heard about the auction. The county was selling off a quarter section on the north edge of town, land that had sat empty and untouched for as long as anyone could remember, anchored by an old windmill that had not turned in 50 years. Nobody knew exactly why the well beneath it had gone dry, or why the previous owners had abandoned it rather than repair it, but the story had calcified into local legend. The land was unlucky, maybe cursed, definitely worthless. The county wanted it off the books, and was willing to let it go for almost nothing. Ruth walked out to see it the day before the auction, Duke trotting ahead of her the whole 3 miles, as though he already knew the way. The windmill stood tall and gray against the sky, its blades frozen at odd angles, streaked with rust, silent in a way that felt less like disrepair, and more like waiting. The house beside it was little more than a shell, roof half caved, but the land itself was flat and open, with good bones beneath the neglect. Duke did not run off to chase rabbits, or sniff the fence line the way he usually did in open country. Instead he walked straight to the base of the windmill and sat, staring up at it, tail still, ears forward, as though he had been called there. Ruth walked a slow circle around the windmill's base, running her hand along the old timber frame, feeling the grain gone silver and rough with age. She noticed the well housing had been sealed over with a heavy stone cap, unusual for a dry well, which most folks simply left open or boarded loose. Someone had gone to real trouble to close this one up tight, and Ruth filed that oddity away without quite knowing why it mattered yet. Duke would not move from his spot at the base of that stone cap, no matter how many times she called him toward the house instead, as if he already sensed the whole town's future was sealed somewhere just beneath his paws. Ruth stood beside her dog and looked up at that ruined windmill, and she thought of her father's voice. Nothing is finished being useful just because folks stopped looking at it. She thought of Daniel, and the 12 good years they had built out of nothing more than stubbornness and care. She thought of the $11.60 folded in her handkerchief, and how little that was, and how it might be enough anyway. The town could call the land cursed. The town could call her a fool. Ruth had already lost everything a woman was supposed to be afraid of losing, and there was a strange, quiet freedom in that. She knelt down next to Duke, put her hand on his back, and made up her mind. Tomorrow, she would spend nearly everything she had left on a piece of land nobody else wanted, and she would find a way to make it enough, the same as she always had. The auction was held on the courthouse steps the next morning, a small, ordinary affair compared to the land sales Miller's Bend usually saw. Most of the crowd had come for a different parcel, a good stretch of grazing land 2 lots over, and they only lingered for the Windmill property out of idle curiosity, the way people slow down to look at a wreck on the road. The county clerk read off the parcel number in a flat, bored voice, listed the acreage, mentioned the dry well and the condition of the structures with the practiced indifference of a man who had given up trying to make bad land sound good. Ruth stood near the back of the small crowd with Duke sitting close against her skirts, his weight pressed warm into her leg the way he always positioned himself when he sensed she needed steadying. She watched Silas Pruitt standing off to one side in his good gray coat, arms folded, not bidding on anything himself, but watching the proceedings with the mild, proprietary attention of a man who owned half the paper in the county, whether his name was on the deed or not. He nodded to Ruth once, politely, the way he might nod to any acquaintance, and Ruth nodded back, feeling the old sting of humiliation she had learned to swallow whole. When the bidding opened, nobody moved. The clerk repeated the opening price, $30 for the full quarter section, structures included, and still nobody raised a hand. A few men chuckled. Someone in the crowd murmured that $30 was still too much for cursed dirt and a dead well, and a ripple of quiet laughter went through the onlookers. Ruth felt her face go hot, but she kept her chin level the way her father had taught her to do at every county fair and church social where someone underestimated her. She raised her hand and said, clearly, that she would take it at the opening price. The clerk blinked, glanced around for any competing bid, found none, and struck his gavel. Just like that, for $30, Ruth Calloway owned a windmill, a ruined house, and 160 acres that not one other soul in the county wanted. A few women nearby exchanged glances that Ruth pretended not to notice. One older man near the front shook his head slowly, the universal gesture of someone watching a fool make a decision they were powerless to stop. Pruitt himself offered the faintest smile, the kind that did not reach his eyes, and said something about wishing her luck with it, in a tone that made luck sound like the last thing he expected her to have. Duke stood the moment the gavel fell, tail low but steady, and pressed his body against Ruth's legs. As she signed the paper, the clerk slid toward her. He did not react to the murmuring crowd at all, did not flinch at the laughter or the pitying stares, as though none of it mattered next to whatever he had already decided about that land the day before. Ruth counted out her money with hands that did not shake, not even a little, and folded the deed into her handkerchief where the coins had been. $29.60 remained to her name. It was not much of a fortune to start a new life on. But walking back down those courthouse steps with Duke at her heel, deed in hand, Ruth felt something she had not felt in months. The strange, solid weight of a decision that was entirely, finally her own. Ruth moved into the ruined house the following week, patching the worst of the roof herself, with scrap lumber and tar paper bought on credit from the mercantile owner, a kind widower named Otis, who had always liked Daniel, and did not have it in him to turn Ruth away. She spent her days clearing brush, mending fence, and trying not to think too hard about the long uncertain stretch of winter still ahead of her. Duke spent his days doing something else entirely. Every morning, without fail, he trotted straight past the house and the barn, and planted himself at the base of the windmill, at that same sealed stone cap over the old well, and simply waited there, patient and unmoving, as though he had an appointment to keep. At first, Ruth thought little of it. Dogs found their favorite spots the way people found their favorite chairs, and she assumed Duke had simply decided the shade beneath the windmill's frame suited him. But by the second week, the pattern had become too deliberate to ignore. Duke would not chase the rabbits that darted through the tall grass nearby, would not investigate the barn owls that nested in the rafters, would not do any of the ordinary, curious things a dog does in new country. He went to the windmill, and he stayed at the windmill, nose low to the stone, tail still, occasionally letting out a low, uncertain whine that Ruth had never heard from him before, not even during Daniel's illness. It was not a bark of excitement. It was something quieter, and more insistent, the sound of a creature that had found something it did not have the words to explain. One cool morning in late autumn, Ruth followed him out there with her coffee still in hand, meaning only to see what held his attention so completely. The air near the windmill's base was different, she noticed, cooler, and faintly damp, carrying a mineral smell she associated with creek beds and old stone cellars, not with dry land that had supposedly given up its water 50 years before. She knelt beside Duke, and pressed her palm flat against the stone cap sealing the well, and though the day was cold, the stone beneath her hand held a strange, faint chill that felt less like ordinary rock, and more like something with cold water moving somewhere beneath it. Duke pressed his head against her arm, whining again, low and steady, and looked up at her, with an expression Ruth had come to recognize over 6 years together. "This matters," the look said, plainly as if he could speak. She ran her fingers along the seam where the stone cap met its housing, and found, half buried under years of blown dirt and dead grass, the edge of a second seal beneath the first, an iron plate bolted down tight, far more deliberate a construction than any dry well in the county had any reason to need. Dry wells got left open, or covered with a few boards to keep livestock from falling in. They did not get sealed twice, with stone and then iron, bolted down like something meant to stay hidden, rather than merely capped. Ruth sat back on her heels, coffee forgotten, and going cold in the grass beside her, and looked up at the windmill towering silent above them both, its blades frozen at that same strange angle they'd held for 50 years. Something told her that whatever lay beneath that stone had been hidden for a reason far larger than one dead well. She thought of her father's old warning, the one about water and power in dry country, the one she had always assumed was just a farmer's caution. She thought of Silas Pruitt's faint, knowing smile on the courthouse steps, the smile of a man who was not worried at all about the widow buying his worthless land. A small cold feeling moved through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She thought, too, of the way Otis at the mercantile had gone quiet, and changed the subject when she'd mentioned buying the windmill land, the way his easy smile had flickered for just a moment before he busied himself with the till. At the time she had chalked it up to simple pity. Now she wondered if it had been something closer to worry. Whatever was down there, someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure nobody ever found it. Ruth looked at Duke, and Duke looked back at her, ears forward, body taut with the same unspoken certainty he'd carried since the day they'd first walked this land together. 50 years of silence, and her dog had known, somehow, from the very first afternoon, that this ground was not finished being useful just because folks had stopped looking at it. Ruth stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and went to fetch every tool she owned. Whatever waited beneath that stone, she intended to see it with her own eyes, before the sun went down. The iron plate did not want to give. Ruth worked at its bolts through the last hour of daylight, with a rusted wrench she'd found in the barn, her palms blistering against the cold metal, Duke pacing a tight circle around her the entire time, occasionally pressing his nose against the plate, as if he could will it open through sheer will alone. 2 bolts came free before dark forced her inside, and she lay awake that night listening to the wind move through the windmill's frozen blades, imagining what might be sealed beneath all that stone and iron. She was back at first light with a hammer, a chisel, and a cup of coffee she never got around to drinking. It took 3 more days of steady work, an hour or 2 stolen each morning and evening between the chores that could not wait, before the last bolt finally sheared loose with a groan of old rusted metal giving way. Ruth pried the iron plate back, and beneath it, the stone cap itself lifted more easily than she expected, as though it had been fitted, once, by careful hands, rather than simply dropped in place. The smell that rose up from the opening was not the flat, dry smell of a dead well at all. It was cool and mineral, and faintly sweet. The unmistakable smell of moving water, mixed with the older, mustier scent of old wood gone damp but not rotted. Duke did not hesitate. He put his front paws on the stone lip, and peered down into the dark with his ears pricked forward, whining once, sharp and eager, before Ruth pulled him gently back by the collar. She lowered a lantern down on a length of rope, and what the light revealed took her breath clean away. 20 feet down, past a shaft lined with old careful timber, water glinted black and still at the bottom, a real spring, alive after all, never dead at all, only hidden, and built into a ledge just above the water line, tucked into a recess someone had carved deliberately into the shaft wall, sat a small iron strongbox, sealed with a simple latch gone orange with rust. She stood there a long moment before attempting the climb down, weighing the risk against the pull of curiosity, and found she could not have walked away from that box even if she'd wanted to. Something in her, some quiet certainty passed down from her father's steady hands, told her this was exactly the kind of overlooked thing worth the risk of reaching for. It took another hour of careful work with a rope harness fashioned from an old plow line, before Ruth managed to lower herself down far enough to retrieve it, Duke barking anxiously from the rim the entire time, refusing to leave until she reappeared with the box clutched against her chest. Her hands shook as she set it down in the grass, not entirely from the cold or the effort, some instinct already warning her that whatever this box held would change more than her own small fortune. The latch broke away easily once she was back on solid ground, the metal too corroded to resist even a light strike from her hammer. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, Ruth found a bundle of papers, old surveys covered in careful surveyor's notation, a hand-drawn map of the county's water sources with several springs circled in fading red ink, and a letter, its handwriting cramped, and its ink faded, but still legible, addressed to whoever might one day find it. She did not have time to read more than the first lines, before the light failed entirely, but those first lines were enough to make her sit very still in the cold grass, Duke's head heavy and warm against her knee, while the full weight of what she might be holding settled slowly over her. The letter began with a name she recognized immediately, a name that still hung above the door of the Miller's Bend Bank in gold-painted letters, Pruitt. The next morning, Ruth carried the letter and the surveys into town, and knocked on the door of Jasper Cole, the county's only lawyer, and one of the few men in Miller's Bend who had never once looked at Ruth with pity. Jasper was old enough to remember the town before the Pruitt family had bought their way into most of it, and he read the letter twice through his spectacles without saying a word, his expression sliding from curiosity to something graver with every line. The letter, he explained once he'd finished, was written by the very man who had built the windmill 50 years before, a settler named Ezra Nash, describing how the Pruitt family's patriarch had discovered that Nash's spring, not the town's official well, was the true source feeding half of Miller's Bend's water. Rather than share it, or pay for it fairly, old Pruitt had pressured Nash off his land, capped his well, and quietly redirected the underground flow toward a second well the Pruitts controlled, and charged the town handsomely to use ever since. Over the following weeks, Ruth and Jasper worked through the surveys at his cramped office table, cross-referencing them against county water records Jasper pulled, with some difficulty, from the courthouse archive. Duke came along every time, curling patiently beneath the table or by the stove, occasionally lifting his head to watch the door, as though standing guard over the work itself. The surveys confirmed what the letter claimed. The spring beneath Ruth's windmill was not some minor trickle, but the true headwater the whole valley depended on. And the water the town paid Pruitt's Bank a monthly fee to access was, and always had been, simply that same spring rerouted through pipe the Pruitts had laid decades ago and never once disclosed. Word moved slowly at first, quiet conversations in Jasper's office, careful questions put to the county clerk, a letter sent to the state land office requesting historical water rights records. But the picture that emerged grew clearer and heavier with every piece Ruth and Jasper uncovered, until it was no longer a matter of an old widow's stubborn hope, but a documented, provable truth. For 50 years, one family had grown wealthy charging an entire town for water that had never legally been theirs to sell. Duke's role in those weeks never diminished. He slept outside Ruth's door each night, ears alert to every sound, and trailed Jasper's clerk to and from the courthouse archive, as though personally overseeing every document retrieved. More than once, Ruth caught herself explaining pieces of the puzzle out loud to him in the quiet of the evening, and more than once, it was watching his steady, patient attention that helped her think clearly enough to see the next step. Ruth thought of the courthouse steps, of the laughter that had followed her home the day she'd bought this land, and felt none of the old sting anymore, only a steady, growing resolve that reminded her more than anything, of the way her father used to work a stubborn piece of machinery back to life, patiently, carefully, and without ever once doubting it could be done. By the time Jasper finally sat back from his desk one evening, and said, quietly, that they had enough now to bring this before the whole town, Ruth understood exactly what that would mean, and exactly who it would mean it for. Silas Pruitt came out to the Windmill property himself, 3 days after Jasper sent a formal notice to the bank requesting a meeting regarding the county's water rights records. He came alone, in his good gray coat, driving a fine trap pulled by a fine horse, and he did not bother knocking before walking straight into Ruth's yard as though he still owned every inch of ground in Miller's Bend, Windmill included. Duke rose from his spot on the porch the moment the trap came into view, and stood at Ruth's side, body low and still, a low growl building steady in his chest, though he did not bark, did not lunge, simply planted himself between Ruth and the approaching man, like a wall made of muscle and old loyalty. Whatever happened next, Ruth understood, would decide far more than the fate of 1/4 section of land. Pruitt's smile was thinner than Ruth remembered from the courthouse steps. He told her, in a voice that tried for gentle, and landed somewhere closer to threatening, that she was a widow alone, with no husband, no sons, and no standing in this county, and that whatever papers she thought she'd found in an old well, would not hold up against a family that had built half the town with its own 2 hands. He suggested, not quite as a favor, and not quite as a warning, that she might consider selling the property back to him, quietly, before things became complicated, in ways a woman on her own could not afford to manage. He reminded her, unnecessarily, that he was the one who held the note on nearly every business in Miller's Bend, and that reputations in a small town were fragile things. Ruth did not flinch. She had buried a husband, lost a farm, and clawed a life back out of $11.60, and she found, standing there with Duke solid and steady against her leg, that she was not afraid of Silas Pruitt in the slightest. She told him, calmly, that she was not selling anything, and that he was welcome to sit down with her and Jasper Cole at the courthouse the following Saturday, when she intended to present Ezra Nash's letter, the original surveys, and the state land office's confirmation of the spring's rightful ownership to the whole assembled town, in public, where everyone could hear it plainly for themselves. Pruitt's careful composure cracked, just slightly, at the mention of Nash's name, a flicker of something uneasy crossing his face, before he smoothed it back into practiced calm. He tried once more, softer this time, almost pleading beneath the polish, reminding her that some old business was better left buried, that digging up 50-year-old grievances would not put food on her table or fix her roof. Ruth answered that she had spent enough of her life letting other people decide what was worth digging up and what wasn't, and that she did not intend to spend the rest of it the same way. Duke's growl deepened, just once, and Pruitt took an involuntary half-step back toward his trap, before catching himself. Saturday came, and the whole town gathered on the courthouse steps, the same steps where Ruth had once stood alone, and humiliated, while men chuckled at her bid. This time she stood beside Jasper Cole, Duke seated calmly at her feet, and read Ezra Nash's letter aloud to a crowd that grew quieter with every sentence. She laid out the surveys, the water records, the state land office's written confirmation, plainly and without embellishment, letting the documents speak in a voice far more damning than any accusation she could have made herself. She watched the faces in that crowd shift from confusion, to disbelief, to a slow, spreading anger, as the town realized exactly how long they had been paying for water that had never belonged to the Pruitts at all. Silas Pruitt tried to interject twice, tried to wave the documents off as forgeries, as an old woman's misunderstanding, but Jasper had already filed certified copies with the county and the state, and the numbers, the dates, the very ink on Ezra Nash's letter, told a story too consistent, and too thoroughly documented to argue away. Within the month, the state opened a formal inquiry into the Pruitt family's water rights. The bank's board forced Silas to resign under the weight of public outrage, and he left Miller's Bend before the first snow, his good gray coat and fine trap carrying him toward whatever town hadn't yet heard his name. Otis from the Mercantile found her afterward, hat in his hands, and admitted quietly that he'd always suspected something was wrong with how the Pruitts priced the town's water, but had never had the proof, or the courage to say so out loud. He was not the only one. Neighbor after neighbor came forward that week to shake her hand, to apologize for the whispers and the pity. to admit they had misjudged the windmill, and misjudged her right alongside it. Ruth accepted every apology with the same steady grace her father had shown her on that porch years ago, understanding better than most that people often need to see a thing proven before they can believe it was ever true. Ruth stood on those same courthouse steps, Duke pressed warm against her leg, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the ground beneath her feet was finally, entirely solid. A year later, the windmill turned again. Ruth had it repaired plank by plank, blade by blade, over that first winter, using money earned from the fair licensing fees the town now paid for water rights she formerly donated to a community trust rather than keep for private profit. She never wanted the Pruitts' old business of charging neighbors for something the land had freely given. Instead, Miller's Bend built a proper well house over Ezra Nash's spring, with a plaque bearing his name and a smaller one bearing Ruth's, and the windmill itself became something of a local landmark, a quiet, turning reminder of what almost stayed buried. Ruth's house grew steadily around her, board by board, the same patient way her father had once taught her to fix anything worth fixing. She kept chickens again, and a small herd of cattle, and though she never remarried, she was rarely without company. Otis stopped by most Sundays with news from the mercantile. Jasper came for coffee, and would talk her ear off about county records if she let him, and Duke, older now, and gray around his one crooked ear, still walked out to the windmill every single morning, though these days he simply lay in its turning shadow, and dozed, his work long since finished. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from building something real out of what everyone else called worthless, and Ruth wore that peace plainly, in the set of her shoulders, and the steadiness of her hands. If you found a hidden piece of history, buried and forgotten by everyone but a loyal dog and a stubborn woman, would you keep it quietly for yourself, or would you share it with the people who needed it most? Ruth chose to share hers, and in the choosing, she built a life sturdier than anything the bank could have foreclosed on. Until next time, stay close.